Every Saturday morning, as the first rays of sun stretched across the frost-covered sidewalks of Capitol Square, the heart of Madison's bustling farmers' market came alive. Local vendors opened wooden stands with fresh bread, apples, and jars of wildflower honey. Families strolled between booths, children sipped hot cider, and the scent of roasted peanuts drifted on the crisp autumn air. And in the far corner, near the lamppost with the rusted plaque, sat an old man. No one knew much about him. Some called him the coin guy. Others didn't call him anything at all. His frame was thin, wrapped in a faded army green coat. His eyes were sunken, not just from age, but from something deeper, the kind of emptiness that comes from decades of silence. He didn't speak. He never asked for help. He just sat quietly, with a weathered paper cup in front of him, and nodded politely when people dropped in coins. Most people passed by. Some paused. Few looked him in the eye. That morning, the wind was sharper than usual. Leaves danced across the cobblestones. As the old man reached to collect a few coins that had rolled from the cup, his hand trembled. A small leather wallet slipped from his coat pocket and hit the ground with a soft thud. The clasp came undone. A photograph slipped out and fluttered across the pavement. A 10-year-old boy named Liam, standing nearby with his mother, noticed it. He darted forward, grabbed the photo before the wind could carry it away, and walked over to return it. "Sir, you dropped this," he said. The old man looked at him, startled, not by the gesture but by the photo. Liam glanced at it. It was black and white, slightly faded. The image showed a young man in a crisp military uniform, standing tall, proud, eyes full of conviction. But even more striking than the pose was the face. It was him, the same man sitting there in silence, only younger, unscarred, and whole. The old man stared at the photograph for a long moment. Then he took it with shaking fingers. For the first time, he smiled. Not a wide smile, but a quiet one. The kind that says, "You saw something others missed." Liam didn't understand what he had uncovered. Not yet. But he would. Because that photograph was not just a memory, it was a promise. A life once lived, a love once held. A war survived, but never left behind. Sometimes all it takes is one boy, one photo, and a second glance to bring a forgotten story back to life. If this story touches you the way it touched me while writing it, leave a like and subscribe. It helps us keep telling stories that move, inspire, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what happens next will change everything. Liam couldn't stop thinking about the photo. It stayed with him, even after they got home from the market. While his mom unpacked groceries and put apples in the fruit bowl, Liam sat at the kitchen table, staring into the distance. He wasn't sure why the old man's eyes had unsettled him, or why the photograph felt like something sacred, something fragile, like it belonged in a frame, not on a cold sidewalk. The following Saturday, Liam returned to the market, this time alone, with a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in foil, a juice box, and an old scarf he had taken from the closet without asking. He walked straight past the bakery stand, past the musicians playing bluegrass on the corner, and approached the bench where the old man, Walter, always sat. Without a word, Liam sat down beside him. Walter didn't look up at first. Then he glanced sideways, saw the boy, and gave a slow, tired nod. Liam reached into his backpack, pulled out the sandwich, and held it out. Walter hesitated, just for a second, and then accepted it. No thank you, no words, just a silent gesture, a shared understanding. From that moment on, it became their ritual. Every Saturday, Liam came back with something small, a cookie, a thermos of coffee, a blanket on colder mornings. He didn't ask questions. Walter didn't offer answers. But there was comfort in the silence, in the way they simply existed next to each other while the world bustled around them. But children, by nature, are curious, and Liam was no exception. A few weeks later, as they sat beneath the branches of an old maple tree in Capitol Square, Liam broke the silence. "Were you a soldier?" he asked softly, eyes still facing forward. Walter didn't respond immediately. His hand trembled slightly as he lifted the cup to his lips. Then, in a voice barely louder than the wind, he said, "A long time ago." It was the first time Liam heard his voice. After that day, something shifted. Walter began to speak more, not in full stories, but in fragments, a place, a date, a name. He spoke of frozen mornings in Belgium, of friends whose faces he remembered more clearly than their names. He spoke of long marches, of letters that never arrived, and of silence. The long, empty silence that came after the war ended and life refused to go back to what it was. At home, Liam's mother, Jenna, noticed the change. He was quieter, more thoughtful. He started keeping a notebook, filling it with words he never used before. Infantry, Normandy, regret. He stopped watching cartoons in the morning. One night, when she walked past his room, she saw him staring at a hand-drawn version of the photo. She confronted him the next day. "You've been seeing that man at the market, haven't you?" Liam nodded. "His name is Walter. He was a soldier." "He's a stranger, Liam. You don't know what kind of man he is." "He's not dangerous," Liam replied. "He's alone." Jenna, like many parents, struggled between protection and permission. She didn't want to seem heartless, but something about the war, about veterans who disappeared into the margins, made her uneasy, so she did what any concerned parent would do. She took the photo and went to Liam's school. Mrs. Dawson, Liam's fifth-grade teacher, also happened to be a history enthusiast. When she saw the picture, she furrowed her brow. "That's a U.S. Army uniform, World War II. I think 1st Infantry Division." She stood up from her desk and pulled a book from her shelf, flipping through pages of grainy photographs. "The big red one," she added. "They were in Normandy and Belgium. A lot of them never came home." Mrs. Dawson made some calls. She reached out to a local veterans center, contacted the public library, even emailed the National Archives. A week later, she had a name: Walter Harris, born in 1921, enlisted in 1942, assigned to the 1st Infantry Division. Thus seen during the Battle of Hurtgen Forest in late 1944, presumed dead, except he wasn't. Liam, unaware of the research unfolding behind the scenes, continued his visits. And with each passing Saturday, Walter grew more present. He told Liam about the last photo he ever took, the one with the promise on the back, about a woman named Mary, whom he had loved before the war, about a home they were supposed to build together. "She married someone else," Walter said one morning, staring into his coffee. "She thought I died, and maybe I did, just not all at once." Liam didn't know what to say, but he didn't have to, because sometimes the deepest wounds don't need words, they just need someone to sit beside them. Mrs. Dawson sat at her desk long after the last bell rang. The photo lay beside her stack of papers, and the face in it haunted her. There was a story in that soldier's eyes, not the kind told in textbooks, but one that had been buried beneath layers of silence, regret, and time. She had seen veterans fade into the background before, but never like this. Never someone declared dead who was, in fact, sitting just a few blocks away, alive and unseen. She contacted the local VA office first. They had no current record of a Walter Harris residing in Madison. But when she checked the archives from the 1940s, there he was, PFC Walter Harris, 1st Infantry Division, enlisted out of Chicago. A quiet, disciplined soldier. Last correspondence dated October 1944, reported missing in action during the Battle of Hurtgen Forest, one of the bloodiest and most chaotic engagements of the entire European campaign. There had been no confirmation of death, only silence. The more Mrs. Dawson uncovered, the more it hurt to think that someone could serve, vanish, survive, and then spend decades wandering without anyone asking where he'd gone. She compiled her findings and shared them with Jenna, Liam's mother, who sat in stunned silence at the kitchen table, her tea forgotten. "He's not just some homeless man," Jenna said quietly. "He was somebody." "He still is," Mrs. Dawson replied. Liam, too, began to notice things. Walter had become more talkative in his way. He shared glimpses of memory, fragments like leaves blown across pavement, the sound of boots in the mud, the terror of shell fire, a letter that never made it home. He spoke of a photograph taken by a fellow soldier the day before they entered the forest, the same photo Liam had found, and the promise scribbled on the back, "For Mary. If I make it home, I'll bring the life I promised you." Liam had written the words in his notebook, over and over. He didn't understand war, not really, but he understood promises, and how it must feel to break one, even if it wasn't your fault. The next Saturday, Liam brought something new, a printed copy of a local newspaper article. Mrs. Dawson had published a short piece in the Madison Gazette titled "The Man on the Bench." It didn't mention Walter's name, but it told of a soldier who had survived one war, only to be forgotten in the peace that followed. It spoke of a boy who sat beside him, week after week, asking nothing, offering only presents. Walter read the article slowly, holding the paper with both hands, his eyes scanning every line. When he finished, he folded it neatly and tucked it into his coat. He didn't say anything. But the next time Liam visited, Walter brought the photograph himself. He placed it between them and tapped the back with one weathered finger. "She was real," he said. "Mary. I met her at a church dance in 1941. Brown hair, stubborn laugh. She said she'd wait." He paused. Then, almost a whisper, "She waited until 1949. Then she married someone else." Liam felt a heaviness settle in his chest. "Did you ever go find her?" Walter shook his head. "What would I have said? That I crawled through hell just to come home too late? That I'd lived in alleyways and bus stations because I didn't know where else to go? I couldn't give her what I promised, and she deserved peace." The boy didn't respond. He couldn't, but he wrote about it later. A poem, though he didn't call it that. Just a paragraph in a blue spiral notebook. He never stopped loving her, not even when the world told him to forget. He loved her like silence, deep, unspoken, and always there. Mrs. Dawson kept digging. With help from a librarian and an old veterans advocate, she tracked down Mary's obituary. She had passed away in 1993 in Sheboygan, survived by 2 daughters and a husband of 41 years. In a box of archived photos at the Sheboygan Library, they found a picture of her in her 20s, standing on a porch, holding a letter. Walter confirmed it instantly. "That's her," he said. They never told him more. He didn't ask. He didn't need to know how long she'd waited or how often she walked past the mailbox. Some things were better left untouched. Like a photograph kept close, not for the hope of reunion, but as proof that something beautiful had once existed. The article in the paper stirred quiet waves across the city. People began to recognize Walter. Some left coffee on the bench beside him. Others simply nodded as they passed. A Vietnam vet approached one day, saluted, and walked away without saying a word. Walter didn't want fanfare. He didn't need banners or medals. But for the first time in decades, someone said his name aloud, and someone listened. Winter came early that year. Snow dusted the rooftops by mid-November, and the market grew quieter as the season wore on. Still, every Saturday morning Liam showed up, a little more bundled, the thermos now filled with hot cocoa instead of coffee. Walter was always there, sitting with the same quiet dignity as if he were part of the city itself, a fixture. A ghost who had finally become visible. They no longer needed introductions, no longer needed reasons. One morning, as the wind blew harder than usual and the benches glistened with frost, Walter reached into his coat and pulled out the photograph, the one that had once slipped onto the sidewalk and changed everything. He handed it to Liam again, but this time with care. Not as a returned item, but as a gift. Liam held it gently, knowing now what it meant. "Turn it over," Walter said. Liam did. He had read the writing before, but now the words felt heavier, more fragile. "For Mary, if I make it home, I'll bring the life I promised you." Walter stared at the words, his eyes distant. "I wrote that the night before we went into Hurtgen," he said. "We were told it would be a hard push, maybe a few days. Most of us didn't come back. didn't come back the same. He paused. I carried that photo through the shelling, through the freezing rain, through the months in a Belgian hospital with no ID, no memory for a while. By the time I could stand on my own again, I didn't know who I was supposed to be. Liam listened in silence. I couldn't write her. I couldn't explain it. I wasn't the man she knew. I had the same face, but everything inside me was broken glass. He told Liam about the years after the war, how he drifted from city to city, unable to settle, unwilling to be found. He worked odd jobs, slept in shelters, avoided the VA. The shame, he said, was heavier than the pack he carried through Europe. I didn't die in that forest, Walter said, but the man she loved did. Liam clutched the photo. But you still kept the promise. Walter shook his head. No, kid, I didn't. That life, I couldn't bring it. All I brought back was silence. They sat like that for a long while, the cold creeping into their boots, the steam from the thermos fading fast. Eventually, Liam spoke. She might have waited, maybe not forever, but for a while. She did, Walter replied quietly, until she couldn't anymore. And that's okay. She deserved joy. Liam hesitated, then reached into his backpack and pulled out a small folder. Inside were photocopies of Mary's obituary and a photo of her from the Sheboygan archive, holding a letter, looking out over a snowy porch. Walter's hands trembled as he looked at it. She had that coat when we met, he whispered. Then softer, she looked for me. She never forgot you, Liam said. Walter nodded. I never wanted her to. That night, Liam wrote in his notebook again. He never stopped loving her. Not in silence, not in distance, not even in death. The photo was never for memory. It was for promise. Even broken, he kept it close. Over the next few weeks, Walter shared more. He told Liam how he used to imagine Mary's voice when things got too dark, how he would picture their little house by the lake, the one they dreamed about before he shipped out. He'd hold the photo against his chest and whisper the same words again and again. I'll come back. But I didn't, he said once. Not really. And yet, Liam had brought something back for him. Not the life he promised, but a reason to remember it. Mrs. Dawson, with the help of the local historical society, began documenting Walter's story. She created a small exhibit in the school library, The Silent Ones. There, next to World War II uniforms and dog tags, was Walter's photo. A note beneath it read, Some soldiers return with medals, others with silence, but all of them carry stories worth remembering. Walter never saw the exhibit. He didn't want to. I'm not a hero, he said. I'm just a man who tried to keep something good alive. Liam understood, because sometimes memory isn't about being seen. It's about being known. The article in the Madison Gazette didn't go viral. There were no headlines, no breaking news, no TV coverage. It was a small piece, just a few paragraphs, buried near the community calendar and lost pet listings, but it struck a chord. People began to notice the man on the bench. One Saturday, a woman placed a paper cup of coffee beside Walter and said nothing. Another day, a retired Navy officer left a folded flag on the edge of the bench, then walked away. A group of high school students came to sit nearby for a class project on living history. And every week, without fail, Liam returned with his thermos and notebook, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Walter said little about it. He never asked for this attention, and he didn't want fanfare. I'm not a monument, he told Liam once. I'm just someone who outlived the noise. But slowly, the silence around him began to change. The local VFW chapter, after reading the article, reached out to Mrs. Dawson. They wanted to help, not with speeches or plaques, but with dignity. Together with the city, they arranged a small room in a nearby assisted living facility for Walter. Nothing fancy, just a clean bed, a window overlooking the lake, and a shelf for his photograph. At first, he refused. This bench is mine, he said. I earned this cold wood. But Liam came prepared. He handed Walter a small leather-bound book, something he had made himself. Inside were copies of the photo, pages from his notebook, drawings of Walter sitting on the bench, and at the very back a note written in his careful, uneven handwriting. I know who you are now. "And I think others should too." Walter held the book for a long time before nodding. "Okay," he said softly, "but no ceremonies." He moved in the following week, but the bench on the square didn't stay empty. A small plaque was placed on the side, not by the city but by Liam and his classmates. It read, "Some heroes don't wear medals. They carry a worn-out wallet and a photo that time never erased." Walter kept coming back though. Every Saturday he sat on the bench again, not as a beggar, not as a ghost, but as a man with a name. People greeted him now. Children waved. Elderly couples nodded in recognition. And Walter, though he still preferred silence, began to offer something new, a smile. One day, a boy approached him, younger than Liam, curious, cautious. "Were you really in the war?" the boy asked. Walter looked at him, then reached into his coat, pulled out the photo, and said, "I was in love. That's what I remember most." That simple sentence traveled further than any battle story ever could. Mrs. Dawson eventually published a longer piece titled "The Man Who Sat Through the Noise." She included parts of Liam's notebook, quotes from Walter, and reflections from those who had passed him for years, never knowing his name. The article was shared across schools, veteran groups, and eventually became part of a traveling exhibit on unsung soldiers. But for Walter, none of that mattered. What mattered was the boy who listened when no one else did. The boy who didn't try to fix him, didn't demand answers, but simply sat beside him long enough for the silence to speak. And for Liam, Walter had become more than a story. He had become a friend, a mentor, a quiet hero who taught him that memory isn't about fame or ceremony. It's about attention, care, and truth. Because sometimes the most profound gesture of recognition isn't a parade or a medal. Sometimes it's a kid with a notebook and enough patience to wait. Winter returned to Madison with a stillness that made even the busiest corners feel quiet. The trees stood bare along Capitol Square, and the market shrank to only the hardiest vendors bundled behind their tables. Snow clung to the benches, and on one morning, one particularly grey Saturday, the space next to the lamppost sat undisturbed. Walter didn't come. Liam arrived early that day, thermos in hand, his notebook zipped in his coat. He waited. Minutes passed. People came and went, but the bench remained empty, and Liam knew, deep in his chest, what the silence meant. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Dawson called. Her voice was softer than usual. Walter Harris had passed away in his sleep sometime during the early hours, a soft smile on his face, the photo resting on the nightstand beside him. The leather-bound book, the one Liam had made, was still open to the final page. There was no big funeral, no taps, no procession, just a handful of people who had quietly become part of his final chapter. Mrs. Dawson, a few veterans, a nurse from the care home, and Liam, who stood small beneath his winter coat, holding the photograph one last time. He stepped forward, placed it gently atop the simple wooden casket, then slid something else beside it, the envelope containing the final page from his newest notebook. "You weren't forgotten," it read. "You weren't invisible. You were the reason I learned to listen." They lowered the casket into the frozen ground as the wind whispered through the trees. Back at the school, Walter's story took root. The Silent Ones exhibit expanded. More students began tracing their own family histories. Veterans started visiting classrooms. And once a year, in the week before Veterans Day, Liam would read aloud the story of the man on the bench, not from a textbook, but from memory. The plaque on the bench in Capitol Square remained. Passers-by began to recognize the spot. Some left small flags, others placed notes, folded in half and tucked into the edges of the wood. But perhaps the most meaningful gesture happened a year later. A boy, no older than Liam had been when it all began, approached the bench and sat in silence. He pulled a drawing from his coat. It showed a man in uniform holding a photograph, sitting next to a young boy on a bench. On the back, he had written, "For the soldier who kept his promise even when no one saw it." Liam saw him from a distance that day. He didn't interrupt. He didn't introduce himself. He just smiled, because he knew Walter's story had passed on, not through medals or monuments, but through attention, through care, through one boy's decision to stop, to ask, and to remember. Because sometimes the loudest legacy is the one that begins in silence and lives on in those who choose to listen. We publish new stories every day, real ones that move, inspire, and remind us that even in silence there is meaning. If this story touched you, leave a like and subscribe. It helps us continue to share the lives that history almost forgot.